I would normally start to regale you with the interesting things about American politics that are going on, but it's incredibly pertinent today. I've been so looking forward to today because whether you know it or not, we have the Republican nomination for the presidency going on all around us, and it's probably just somewhere off your radar screen. Hopefully not. Hopefully you've got this class this semester. I've been so looking forward to this class because I'm trying to, in our class today, give you an overview of a class that I teach to upper division students called Political Parties and the Electoral Process. And we talk about a ton of different things, and I was looking at your chapters that you read for this week, and they give you sort of a nice overview. While we can't cover all of that, I want to give you the most central thing, particularly as it relates to us today, dealing with the American political order and how we nominate and elect a president. So there's two processes today that we'll start with. I go back and forth in terms whether, and the other half of class today we'll talk about political parties and what's a political party and how do they come to be and what are they and what do they do and that kind of thing. And where are the political parties different today? Predominantly we have a two-party system, the Democrats and Republicans. Where do they differ? Where are they similar? What's a political party, that kind of thing. So as I looked at your reading for this week, you got some backdrop of that. I'd like to kind of flesh that out a little bit for you, and particularly end today talking about the distinctions between the political parties and current day. Yes? Were you waving at me? No.
It's also AS election week.
And it is AS election week, which is the other thing, thank you, that I wanted to get your feedback on. There's been a couple campaigns that were disqualified for reasons of we won't discuss, I guess. I mean, nothing insidious. Just I think there were some rules, and I just sort of heard snippets of it. Nevertheless, we're down to two. Okay, so Chris Yim and a young lady, I don't know, Laura Cook. Okay, and then Beatrice and Natasha, those two. Tell me, just in a continuation of our focus group, and they won't see this or hear this or whatever. I'm curious. What do you, just initially, have those people come across your radar and how?
Well, I was kind of set on voting for Chris.
Well, you don't have to go there, but okay,
well, no,
okay.
I'm going to explain.
Okay, that's fine.
Because I knew of him and I heard things in my circle of friends.
Yeah.
And then I kind of stumbled upon the fireside chat yesterday night. Randomly, literally, I'm like, what's going on? Ooh, they're talking. And then I hadn't gone to the Monday chapel. I've only seen posters of Natasha and Beatrice, but they were so solid last night. They were just fully organized, eloquent, had their composure. Every question that came their way, they just answered it flawlessly.
Okay.
So now I don't really know at all.
Well, now I mean, for the average Biola student, you've been exposed to a pretty significant depth because you've heard them speak. You know, for most of them, most folks, it's just sort of, oh yeah, I see some posters around. Tell me what you think of Beatrice and Natasha's posters. Have you seen them? Tell me what on the tip of your tongue. What's your reaction to that poster?
I like them a lot.
You like them?
Yeah, I just saw one this morning. They were sitting in front of the business building, I think. And the picture is of one of them in her track outfit.
Right. Okay.
The other one in business attire, so it kind of diversifies them and shows that they're aware or part of the school.
So, you can tell me something about it. I mean, this is how political scientists think and campaign stuff. She can tell me something about it. She recognized that one was dressed in sort of a business suit, maybe in front of a business building, I believe, or either that or Talbot, the new Talbot building, one of the two. One of the new fancy things. They're certainly not taking a picture in front of the Grove, are they? All right. So, but you know that one of them is dressed one way and one of them is dressed another, and that communicates something to you. Interesting. Okay? Yeah, Nasa? Okay, so they know you're familiar with their slogan. What's Mr. Yim and what's her name? Laura. What's their slogan?
Praise, partnership, and so on.
There's three. Yeah, there was 3 P's. I noticed that. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
I noticed. I've just studied it this morning and briefly looked at their sites.
Okay.
And the difference I saw was seemed one group was more about the community now while we're at Biola and advancing like the social aspect and increasing that, whereas the other one was more focused on how can we equip you after you leave Biola.
Oh. And which one was that? Which is the one that wants to train you, or to focus more on sort of after Biola?
It's the Christian one.
So the three Ps are more focused future tense, and Beatrice and Natasha are more sort of, your perception was more current.
That was my perception.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Interesting. Now I'm going to suck you all into voting. Now at the very least I'm going to be up here doing this stuff, but interesting. Okay, good. Well, good. Well, I guess that they have now a week to try to garner your attention and somewhat of your support, enough to pay attention, maybe think about voting and why you might vote. So what'll be interesting is after the election, which takes place, I guess, next week, it'll be interesting to talk. And, you know, I mean, I don't think we want to say, well, I voted for them for this reason or whatever, but maybe just generically we can talk about it and say, well, I ended up voting because X, Y, and Z, and I ended up voting for one of the two tickets because I felt like blah, blah, blah. And you don't have to sort of identify them specifically. If you want to be, you know, interesting, they'll be very interested in knowing sort of how to, because they're thinking about running a campaign. So anyway, okay, well, good, well, good. All right, well, what do we have here? New software is available from Apple. I think I will pass on that right now. I would like to, I go back and forth about starting with parties or starting with the electoral process. It's, as you will see by the end of class today, it is we're talking about two different sides of the same coin, because this story of the evolution of how we nominate and end up electing presidents, the other side of that story is the evolution of political parties in the country. If you recall, George Washington sort of waved us off on parties and says, don't go there. Don't do this political parties thing. It'll lead to heartburn, and you just don't want to go there. Well, Washington sort of fades from the scene, and we start political parties pretty quickly after he leaves. So we'll look at the advent of political parties in the second half of class. During this first half of class, I want to focus on, particularly given the fact that this is playing out right in front of us now. In fact, last night in the state of Illinois, part of what's called the nomination process played out in the Illinois primary. And that's why I'm online here a little bit. I want to show you something after break about how that actually worked out. And I want you, at least just at this point, to note in your mind that there's a distinction between how we nominate, parties nominate people for the presidency, and how we elect them. You're probably more familiar with this process than this, so I'll spend some more time on this nomination process. How many of you right now, if forced with a piece of white paper, and we won't take the time to do this, so not to worry, if you were to say, if you had to write 2 or 3 intelligible paragraphs on how the Republicans are nominating a candidate for the presidency, could you do it? Probably not. That's probably not. Yeah, I'm seeing the eyes. That's okay. That's good, because that's fertile teaching ground for me. My hope is by the end of this hour, you'll be able to write 2 or 3 intelligent paragraphs on it. You could, and that's the goal. All right, and then the second half of class today is we will look at the key background in terms of the other side of this coin, political parties, and again, it's a complementary story that we're going to tell here. And then we'll end by looking at some of those key concepts that you got from the chapters that you read. Okay, so let's dive in. Again, the first thing to notice, or y'all, this is, I preach this like the good reverend that I try to be to my upper division students. The key in many cases, before you get lost in detail, is to understand the big picture of things. And that's applicable to whatever class you're in. So always seek to understand the big picture of things, and then the detail will flow better and you'll understand it better within there. So in my parties and elections class yesterday, and they're getting tired of me doing this, but they ought to get the hint that I'm not going to stop doing this, is we talked about a chapter yesterday in state and local elections. And I said, summarize that chapter for me in a sentence. And they just stared at me. And I said, wouldn't it have been great if our author of our chapter did that for us? And he did. And I said, all right. So they sat there and they muttered for a few minutes, and I said, turn to page, blah, 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 whatever it was. And I said, there it is. They just handed it to you. And in that particular case, it was, in this chapter, we will seek to demonstrate how state and local elections are a mixture of old style and new style of politics. Well, that's a nice sort of big umbrella to sort of hang all the detail under. Today, this is our umbrella. We're going to, during the first half of class, try to understand the nomination process. And then on the back half of class, we're going to, and then back half of the first half here, we'll look at the election process. The back half of class, we'll look at political parties. Pitiful amount of board space, but our goal here during this 1 and 2 here is to try to discern, hello ladies, who's the other Paul? Okay. What do you know about all these gentlemen? Let's just talk about that so far. What do you know about all these guys? They're all Republicans. So that's one thing we know, and you see that denoted by an R behind their names. That tells you something already. Okay? What are they about the business of doing right now? What do you understand these guys to be traveling around the country doing? Running for president? Sort of. Sorry? Whose nomination? They are in a step toward running for the presidency. They are, as Asnat has nicely said here, they are actually competing amongst themselves, amongst Republicans, to determine who amongst them will get what's called the Republican nomination for presidency. Okay? It's sort of like if we were to have an AS election and we were to say, okay, in general, we're going to have a competition amongst the girls and amongst the guys, and the girls will sort of compete at sort of one stage, and the guys will compete on a similar type thing, and one girl and one guy will emerge from that, and that one girl and one guy will run against each other to see who's going to be the next AS president. That's sort of what's taking place right now. The Republicans are competing in-house to determine what person will emerge of these four, and it's looking like Mitt Romney, after last night, and I'll talk about that, will emerge to challenge the Democrat, Barack Obama, because Obama is unchallenged at this point. I mean, no Democrat has stepped up and says, I think he's done a horrible job. I think I will challenge him for the Democratic nomination for president. So there is a ghost nomination process going on where nobody's challenging Obama. Obama will be the Democratic nominee for president again, short of something really funky happening. He's unchallenged right now. The Republican situation is a contested nomination, and that's really what you see going on before you here. So in Illinois last night, if you're a resident of Illinois, or yesterday, you were presented with this kind of choice to determine something. Okay, so I'd first like to talk about this nomination process. I'll show you how historically it's worked. At the end of the day, I don't care how you know it was done in 1820. What I want you to see is that the process has become more democratic, meaning democratic with a small d, meaning that you and I actually get more of a say in the process. That's really what I want you to see. I want you most notably to understand how we do it today. That's really the focus of what we're doing here. So let's walk through this process and help you understand what's going on here. So the first one, this is what the Republicans are doing now. 4 years ago, both the Republicans and Democrats did this because both parties needed to nominate a candidate, and then they were both contested. If you recall, Barack Obama ran against essentially Hillary Clinton and a guy named John Edwards and some other minor candidates for a while, and it essentially emerged in a contest between Hillary and Barack Obama, and Barack Obama won after a pretty long, bitter contest. John McCain emerged as the Republican nominee from the last time around. All right. So this process, of which I'm about to give you a bit of an historical overview, is a process that's become more democratic. You and I have more of a place in it than we used to. We used to merely be informed of who was running for president by these parties. You just read about it in the paper. Oh, so that's who the Republicans are putting up this year. Do I want to vote for him? No, I don't know. But you didn't have a say in terms of who the Republican was going to put up or who the Democrats might put up. So that's why I want to tell you this brief historical story about how it's become more democratic. The good people of Illinois actually got to weigh in on who they thought should be the Republican nominee for president. And at last count, I think last night Mitt Romney was somewhere around 43% of the vote. Santorum was somewhere about 31% of the vote. So when all the when the people of Illinois voted yesterday in the Republican primary, 43% of them said, we weigh in on Mitt Romney. We think he's the guy. And 30-some-odd% of them who voted said, no, we think it's Rick Santorum. So I'll look up on the internet here. It was sort of coming in late last night. Yes?
So all people
You could tell I qualified there. It depends on whether it's a closed or open primary. And Illinois was an open primary. So if I'm losing at this point, we'll come back to it. But if this makes sense to you, Illinois had an open primary last night, which means that any person interested in Illinois yesterday could have participated in that primary. Democrat, Republican, Communist, Green Party member, whoever.
people who are usually not Republican like vote for like the weaker.
They can play games. They can certainly play games, and what you call crossover voting. And if you want to play political games, you vote for the weakest of the candidates from the other party, hoping that he or she gets the nomination so that your candidate runs against the weakest. But way ahead of us. All right. So far, so good? Now, this isn't boring stuff because, man, this stuff's playing right out in front of us. Let me give you just a brief historical overview. And again, it's not that I want you to see the mechanics of how it was done in 1820 versus 1870 or something like that. I just want you to see how the process has become more democratic and how it's done today. That's our focus here in the first half. All right. In the original situation, starting at the formation of the Constitution through 1828, and you'll notice that this is going to show up in the back half of class 2 because this is when mass political parties start. Mass political parties start in the late 1820s, and it's going to change the way nominations happen. Prior to us having political parties like you think about political parties today, grassroots, where people, the average person, can participate and be involved in a political party. Prior to that, this is how nominations happened. It wasn't party related. It was just simply a bunch of people getting together in Congress and at the state legislative level and going, who do you think should run? Who do you think should be the president? And they just sort of lifted up names for people. And, you know, they were not any big surprises. So hey, how about George Washington? Hey, now there's a great idea. How about John Adams, Jefferson, James Monroe? Big names, right? And that's how it happened. It was just sort of discussions that they would have in the federal Congress and in the state legislatures. They would just sort of offer names. And not surprisingly, it wasn't Bill Smith from Roanoke, Virginia. It was George Washington, Thomas Biggies. So that system lasts until about the founding generation starts to die out, right? I mean, Madison and Adams and Jefferson, they're all dying right around the late 1820s into the 1830s. I think Madison's one of the last of sort of the biggies. I think he dies in 1836. So they're starting to fade from the scene, and now people being nominated for president weren't fighting with George Washington and, you know, all that stuff. So, okay. Now, ask yourself this question. If that's how people got on the ballot to vote, or so that we end up voting for the president in what's called the general election, you don't have much of a say in that. In fact, almost no say. They're not asking you. These highfalutin folks in these legislative bodies just get together and talk about it. And you just informed of who's running for president, vote for him. Or not vote for him. It's up to you. Okay? Fair enough. From 1832 to 1900, now political parties are in the process, or now they're in play. And now we introduce what's called a delegate. This is where it gets a little bit funky. And this is what we're doing today. So this will be important to sort of understand. Now we start to have delegates to something called a national party convention, a political party convention, and they are selected, these delegates are selected by state and party organizations. Okay, so let's try to give you a second to write what you want to write, and then let's step back and try to digest this a little bit. There's something indirect going on here that you need to see, and that's the hard part of the nomination process. This is kind of fun. This is a challenge for me to try to help you understand this, because if I asked you to try to explain this 15 minutes ago, blank pieces of paper. And that might frustrate you, but it excites me because I'm thinking, hey, this is an opportunity for me to help you sort of see what's going on here. All right. So let's think about the election of 1860, just as an example. That falls within this realm. How in the world did Abraham Lincoln's name get associated with running for president? So in the election of 1860, essentially this is what the Stephen Douglas. Okay, those were the three major candidates running for the presidency in 1860. The question before us now is, how in the world did Abraham Lincoln's name get on there with an R behind his name? And here's the answer. There were certain delegates that showed up to Chicago, Illinois, to the Republican National Convention, a real convention. You know, they show up to a convention hall, real people come and sit in real chairs, so don't think abstractly. This is real people. And some of those people who showed up to the Republican National Convention were delegates. These are the actual people with the power to say Abraham Lincoln should be our nominee. How do they get their positions as delegates? Well, they're chosen by state and party organizations. Where are you involved in this process as an average citizen? Sorry? You're not. Okay? So again, that's really the rub of the story. I don't care if you remember how Abraham Lincoln was nominated. I just wanted you to see that piece. You're not involved in this. There's some people you don't know named delegates who are showing up to Chicago, Illinois that summer. And how did they get there? Well, state and party organizations said, Jennifer, you're a delegate this year to the Republican convention. You say, thank you very much. And you're a big political bigwig in the state and blah, blah, blah. So this is still a pretty elite type game, okay? So if this is escaping you, no big deal. But now we're starting to eke into the 20th century, and now we're starting to get to stuff where you do need to know this, okay? Starting in 1904, the manner in which delegates are chosen starts to change. Prior to 1904, whoops, did I go back? Prior to 1904, they were chosen by state and party organizations, bigwig political fat cats. But starting in 1904, a majority of the states continue to do it that same way, but a minority of states start to have what's called primaries and caucuses. we'll just talk about primary elections. Okay, so again, starting in 1904, a majority of the states continue to do it like they've been doing since 1828. But in a minority of states, they start to do it the way we do it today. And that's where you have national party conventions populated by delegates, and they're chosen via primary elections. The key for you to see here, folks, is that these primary elections are a kind of indirect election. That's the hardest part for me to communicate to you, and I'll camp on it until I see the glow in your face of, oh, I love this stuff. I'm going to be a political science major now. That's how long I'll stay on this. You're still writing, so I'll... Now notice how close we're getting here, up to 1968. Something happens in 1968, and it kicks something in and causes the system to change, or to do this on a majority basis where it was only done on a minority basis before. And I'll tell you that story here in a second. Okay? This, in a majority of situations you've already seen, is not very democratic, meaning you don't really have much of a say. When real live people can vote in a primary election, now you're starting to have a say. Those people in Illinois yesterday were able to be very democratic. They got to show up at polling places and actually cast votes for Mitt Romney or Rick Santorum or Newt Gingrich or Ron Paul, essentially, last night. Okay? All right, so now we bring it full circle to today. Let me just finish it. I'll go back to the indirect primary in a second. This is how we do it today. So starting in 1972, 1968 was a very contentious election year, and I'll tell you a little story about that in a second. And it changes the system to where now, in a majority of the states, and in fact almost all of them now, delegates to the National Party Convention. And what's the role of a delegate at the National Party Convention? To actually nominate a candidate for president, a party's nominee. So I'll give you a second to write this down, because I really just want you to sort of hear me, and we'll talk about how it's playing out now on the Republican side, and I think this will start to make some sense to you. Madame, can I read that? The bullet item at the bottom says, state delegates are awarded to candidates depending on how well they do in a primary or caucus. So state delegates are awarded to candidates depending on how well they do in a primary or caucus. Now that's probably just words to you right now. So that's why I want to relate it to what's going on in front of us on a day-to-day basis today. And I think this will start to make sense to you. Okay. This is how we do it today, and this is what I want to spend a little time unpacking. So I want you to see two things. Not only the mechanics of how this works, but your role in it. There's going to be a primary out in California on late May, early June. I can't recall when the Republicans have scheduled their primary out here. Late May, early June. So if you're so inclined, you could actually play a part in the process of who will emerge from the Republican contest called the nomination process, and who will emerge as the Republican nominee for president. Okay? Now, I want to wipe this away because I need some board space here. So has everybody got what they need here? Okay. There's a three-step process that we're actually been talking about. I just want to sort of get it out, mapped out visually for you to see here. Starting in January, this is actually pretty pathetic, isn't it? Starting in January, and we'll just talk about the contemporary one that's going on around us. The primary caucus season started, and that runs through June. And And during this is the primary caucus season. Okay? And in all 50 states, in fact, even in places like Puerto Rico and little American protectorates, they have little mini elections, and they have no effect on Barack Obama or the Democrats. This is all contained this year, during this year. Last time around, 2008, the Democrats did their little primary and caucus season, the Republicans did theirs. This year, since Barack Obama is not challenged, he is going to be the Democratic nominee for president. There's only one, the Republicans. Okay? Any questions about if I lost you? Hopefully not. Okay, good. So starting in January, the first caucus was in Iowa, if you recall. The first primary was in New Hampshire, and then they went to South Carolina and Florida, and they've just been going on and on and on. Last night was Illinois. The next big one is Louisiana coming up Saturday. Okay, you get my drift? They're doing this by state, and they're having what's called mostly primary elections. All right, what's a primary election? A primary, well, let me finish this first, and I'll talk about a primary. That's step one. What happens in step one determines who shows up to step two, and that's the nominating convention. That for the Republicans this year will be in Tampa, Florida. A godforsaken hole. No, it's not that bad, but are you a fan of Tampa?
Yeah.
Are you?
Florida.
You what?
Florida.
What part now?
East Coast.
Okay, so I like the East Coast a little better than the West Coast. I lived in Tampa for 2 years, so it's just, Anyway, the Republicans think it's a great place, and they're going to show up to Tampa, Florida in August of this year, and they're going to have their nominating convention. It will not be official until after these people do something to where somebody will emerge from the Republicans officially. One candidate will emerge from this national nominating convention as the Republican nominee for president. That person will go on to step 3, called the general election. And there they will compete against Barack Obama for who's going to be the president. At that point, there'll be a ballot that you and I will look at, and it will look like this. Obama with a D behind his name, and at this point it looks like Romney with an R, and there might be some minor candidates that you'd see on there. Ralph Nader running for the Green Party or whatever, right? Okay? But essentially we have a contest between a Democrat and a Republican. What starts here, culminating here, will determine how one guy's name is going to get on a ballot with an R behind his name. That's what we're talking about now. You and I have a say in that today, and that brief little historical tour I gave you showed that we didn't used to have much of a say at all in that. We were just informed. Big fat cat political people smoking cigars told us who was going to be the nominee. All right, so now there's going to be this question of delegates. Last night in Illinois, I think they had 64 delegates up for contention. All right, so this is the hardest part. So sink in here and try to get this. You're going to see the indirect nature of what's going on here. Those people in Illinois last night thought, in an uneducated fashion, that when they showed up to vote in the voting booth last night and there was a ballot that looked again like this, Romney, Santorum, Gingrich, blah, 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 and they checked a box or whatever they did electronically, right? You voted before, I hope. Those people in Illinois thought that when they were casting their vote for one of these four guys, that they were saying directly, I think Mitt Romney should be president. That's not actually what's okay. The primaries that are taking place in these caucuses, I'll draw a distinction between them here in a second. The primaries and caucuses that take place are only indirect. So what are they doing? They are actually saying, and again, I think the percentages were something like this. I think Gingrich got like 9% of the vote or something, okay? What they were actually doing in Illinois last night were saying, how many of these delegates, 64 in the case of Illinois, how many of those real live people who will eventually show up to Tampa, Florida, how many of them will be Romney delegates and how many of them will be Santorum delegates and Gingrich delegates and Paul delegates? This is the part where I start to lose people. So talk to me if you're not getting this, because this is key for you to see. This played out in front of us last night, and I'm going to show you during the break. I'll pull up on the internet and I'll show you political websites where they'll say, and I'm thinking I remember that number right, it's somewhere around the 60s, high 50s in Illinois last night. Illinois, 69. Okay. So up for grabs last night in Illinois were 69 delegates. So 69 people who are the residents of the state of Illinois and who are Republicans were up for grabs last night. So if you put all those people in a room, think about those 69 people in a room last night watching the election return come in. Of those 69, based upon how this came out last night, a certain percentage of them will now be committed Romney delegates. Those 69 real people will get an all-expense paid trip to Tampa, Florida, God help them, and they will show up to the Republican nominating convention and they will sit on the floor of the, not on the floor, they'll have nice chairs, but they sit on what's called the floor of the convention. Everybody else is in sort of like bleacher type stuff. So when you go to the concert by Pavarotti or some big guy, they're in the $500 seats and we're up there in the $20 seats watching all this happen. Those 69 people are joined by the delegates from these other states, and they will cast their votes, those delegate votes, and Mitt Romney, or whoever comes to the convention, must accumulate 1,144 of those delegate votes in order to secure the nomination. Yes, good. Love questions.
How are the delegates assigned, like which ones?
Based upon how this came out.
Well, like how do they, like which ones represent which?
Okay. Some states are winner take all. Some are what's called proportion. It gets a little funky, and I don't want to confuse you, but all I want you to understand just in general is this. Depending on how this vote came out, these will get farmed out in certain ways. So Romney, based upon that, probably would get somewhere around 52, and Santorum might get 20. Well, we're already over. You know, something, 10, and Gingrich might get 1 or something, So that's how they would get farmed out. So you could, at the end of the night, go up to those 69 people and say, all right, now how many of you are now committed Romney delegates? And 52 of them would say, me. They will show up to Tampa, Florida, and you could meet them at the airport. You could go to a pretty nice little airport they've got down there in Tampa and meet them as they come off the plane and shake their hands and say, where are you from and what delegate are you? Who are you committed to? They'd say, I'm from Illinois and I'm a committed Romney delegate. Fantastic, nice to meet you. Okay, so don't get lost in the abstract. These are real live people who will show up to the convention. And the name of the game for Mitt Romney to eventually get his name here to challenge Obama in the general election is to accumulate that number of delegates, and he got maybe about 50 last night in Illinois. We'll look and see what the actual number is. Yes, ma'am.
Where does that number come from?
The Republicans have, so when you add up, like when you see, oh, you don't see this right here. I'll show you this. When you add up all the delegates, it's just the simple majority. So how many delegates does California have? It's a big state, so we're going to have a lot. We're going to have 172, right? So we have 172 real-life Republicans out here who are going to show up to Tampa, Florida, And when I add the 172 plus Illinois 69 plus Missouri's 27 plus blah, 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 they add up to 2,000 something. It takes a simple majority of those delegates to get you over. So now here, okay, please, Jennifer.
Okay, my question is, if the amount of delegates is based off the primary caucus results, how is like this system better or even really different than just pulling together all of the results from the primaries? Like, because isn't it pretty much going to be the same?
No, because some states are winner-take-all states, meaning if you get one more vote than your closest competitor, you get all the delegates.
Oh, okay.
In Illinois last night, they did proportional voting, so they farmed it out, and I'll look at the break and see how it's sort of how those 69 got farmed out.
Do a lot of states do it where they like?
It depends on how the Republicans want to do it. Okay. And I don't want to get too, if you're a political science major and you're in my parties and elections class, we talk about the intricacies of how the Republicans decided to do it this year. They decided to have an elongated process this year in which there was a lot of proportional type stuff like this going on, and so they wanted the process to drag out longer, and now they're regretting it because it's getting drug out and it's getting kind of nasty, and people are like, oh, you know. So if you're interested in beating the president, it's like, man, this is just helping Obama now because the Republicans are just beating up on each other. So they've decided to do a lot of states early on that were proportional. So if it's proportional, then it's going to take Romney or whoever ends up merging longer to get to that number. If Illinois was a winner-take-all, then he would have gotten 69 and these other guys get hosed. And you can get to that number quicker, but the Republicans have decided to do it longer. There are some winner-take-all states coming up here pretty soon, and you're going to see Romney's delegate numbers go way up. Okay, other questions?
Which one's California?
When is California?
Which one? Like, is it winner take all or?
No, I think California is proportional. It'll be over. I think it's going to be over. California's is on June 5th. Sorry, June 5th. So it's going to be a while, but I think it's going to be over by then. Last night was a sort of one of those events in the nomination process. It kind of made it really look like Mitt Romney's going to get it. So it's time to either cry or celebrate or whatever or yawn or whatever your natural reaction is to that. It looks like the person who's going to eventually get to here, which is really what we're talking about, will be Mitt Romney. Celebrating, lamenting. Did you have a bet? Did you bet $20 on it or no? She bet? Huh?
Did you? No, I'm a Christian. I don't bet.
You're a Christian and you don't bet. Okay. That's good. Very good. All right. So what I want to return to our slides here, and now I want to show you what an indirect primary is, and just in verbiage. And hopefully in light of this, it'll make sense. Now, looking at this slide, which I take it a few minutes ago, you just wrote words. Does that make more sense to you now? So from 1972 forward, a majority of National Convention delegates, we saw 69 of them from Illinois get sort of farmed out, are chosen by state primaries. Illinois happened last night, and something called caucuses. I'll say something about that. So these state delegates, to Jennifer's question, are awarded to candidates depending upon how well they do in a primary. And you saw, that right here last night from Illinois. So those 69 real people got farmed out based upon how the good people of Illinois voted yesterday. And we'll do the same thing on June 5th in California, and our 172 will get farmed out in some way. Okay? That is an indirect primary. It's indirect because you're not actually voting directly for the candidate. You're voting to say what number of your state's delegates will be committed Romney delegates or Santorum delegates or Paul delegates. Okay, so now this should make sense. If it doesn't, let's go back at it, because this is playing out in front of us right now, and I want to make sure you understand what's going on. Give you a second. I want to tell you about what happened in Illinois in 1968, and I want to tell you what a caucus is. Those are two pieces we haven't sort of said, and those are just little stories here that I think will be interesting to you. Okay? And it's the indirect nature of this story that generally eludes you. And the reason you could probably not write one sentence on a page 30, 40 minutes ago was because of that. Now, if you were given a piece of paper, could you give it a stab? Yeah? Oh, we're growing. We're growing. I love it. All right. Let me tell you what a caucus is. A caucus is another kind of one of these little preliminary elections. Instead of people showing up to voting booths and doing sort of normal type electoral voting activities like they did in Illinois last night, some of the states don't do primaries, they do caucuses. And a caucus is essentially this. It's literally a group of people who are politically active in the state, and you could go to these if you want to, so it's still democratic. You could show up to one of these things in a schoolhouse, a church, or a city hall or something, and they have little caucuses all over the state. And they actually sit there in a very democratic kind of way and lobby for their candidates. So for the first hour, we will hear about the virtues of all the different candidates. And then somebody will stand up and say, okay, now it's time to vote. And they'll say, all right, how many of you want to vote for Romney? And they'll literally talk about, grassroots politics. So in the church basement, there's 100 people, and they're all caucusing, talking about the virtues of the various candidates, and then they vote. So of those 100 people, 50 of them say, I think Mitt Romney's the greatest thing since sliced bread, and somebody writes 50. All of those caucuses over the state get added up, and we see who showed up. So you have, it's a bigger commitment, right? It's one thing to sort of walk down the street to your neighbor's house where the voting booth is and sort of cast your vote in a primary. It's a whole nother thing for you to get off the couch on a cold Iowa night in January, show up to the local schoolhouse and caucus for your candidate. So those, a lot less people participate in for that reason, but all they're doing is adding up all the little schoolhouse church meetings in these caucuses, and they're farming out delegates like that instead of primary type elections. Not very many states caucus, yes. It's either or. Most states do primaries, that's why I camped on that. We do a primary out here, so if you want to participate in the California primary, you can show up, and it would just be like voting normally, at the firehouse for me, or my neighbor down the street usually has it in his garage or something. Okay? That's what Mitt Romney, that's what Santorum are doing now. They're going state to state, competing in these different primary elections, and now you're in a position to be able to see this, where you can see by numbers what's been going on. So on January 3rd in Iowa, they had the first caucus. The first primary happened in New Hampshire, and look at the numbers. Little bitty numbers, right? Iowa only had 28 delegates that were going to get farmed out. New Hampshire, 12. The first big state down the pike was, Georgia? 76? Florida was pretty big at 50. So the biggest states are still sort of up for grabs. New York, California, Texas, that kind of thing. So I'll show you here, I'll pull it up at the break, how Romney's doing right now versus the other candidates, working toward that 1144 figure. So when you get down toward the end of the process, you can see, where's California? California, 172, and all of those here, between here and here, are going to take place on June 5th. There was a big one not too long ago. In fact, I mentioned it to you. It was called Super Tuesday. That took place on March 6th. March 6th. So Alaska through Virginia, all of these states had their primaries and caucuses on that day. So there was a lot of delegates up for grabs. Romney won about 60% of those delegates. So of those delegates that were farmed out that particular day, Romney won about 60% and really increased his lead over Santorum and Gingrich and Paul that day. Okay, now I'm hesitant to leave the nomination thing and move to the general until I sort of feel the glow. Any questions about that yet before we leave this? Again, that's what's playing out in front of us today. Okay, again, let me tell you what happened in 1968. The reason that we went from a majority of states continuing to do it like they did from 1928 and to a minority of states started to do primaries and caucuses, after 1968, most everybody went to primaries and caucuses, and here's why. In 1968, Hubert Humphrey emerged as the Democratic nominee for president, challenging President Nixon. Yes, Nixon. No, Nixon was the Republican nominee for president that year. Hubert Humphrey participated in 0 primaries and caucuses. He just didn't go through the process. It takes work, right? I mean, these candidates actually have to physically show up to these states, give speeches, develop campaign organizations, and get out the vote efforts and all that stuff. Humphrey participated in none of it. He just showed up at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago that year and just sort of said, I'm the man, and enough delegates said, yeah, I think you're right. And he emerged as the Democratic nominee for president, and he got killed by Nixon that year. It was a landslide election. So the Democrats said, we're not doing it this way anymore. And so essentially after that very contentious election, the Democrats and Republicans went to the primary caucus deal to farm out their delegates. All right, last call before we move to the general. Oh, good, love it, yes.
How are the delegates chosen?
How are the delegates chosen? Interesting question. It's an internal state decision by the state Republican Party. So the 172 California delegates are chosen internally by the California Republicans. So they'll call you and they'll say, hey, you know, you've been sort of involved in California politics for a while. How would you like to be a delegate to the National Party Convention this year? And you say, I love drinking heavily, so I will go to the National Party Convention. Because that's, boy, there is a lot of heavy drinking that goes on at these party conventions. It's like a week-long party that they participate in more than one sense. Yeah, it is. It's quite interesting in that regard. I'm trying to actually get, not for that reason, I'm actually trying to get to Tampa to actually, I'm not a California delegate, but I'd like to go and just observe it. I've observed them on TV. I'd like to actually do it. Yeah, please. No, it's great.
So can you clarify how moving after, let's see, 1968, you said you just explained what happened and why everyone moved to this form. How did that fix it?
Well, what they didn't want to have happen is just some guy ride in at the end of the process. I mean, to show up at the end, you know, on the blackboard, just sort of show up at the end and say, I know I haven't been through that 6-month process. And actually, these Republicans have been running for president for over a year now. Can you imagine? I mean, I saw some of these guys on TV last night being interviewed. They look like they have literally been through the war. I mean, they're just like, they're trying to put this bright smile on their face, but you can just see that the year-long process on a daily basis of being before the cameras and having every word they say, you know, parsed out and stuff like that. I mean, you have to literally be aware of everything you say. Rick Santorum was asked the other day about the unemployment rate. And his comment was, and he was asked in the context of, if the unemployment rate gets better, does that make you more or less of a viable candidate? Assuming the unemployment rate goes down and it gets better for the American people, it would seem to strengthen Obama's position and weaken his. So he said like this, he goes, look, I don't care about the unemployment rate, I'm still a viable candidate. Oops. The old editing will happen in Democratic National Headquarters, and they'll run a political campaign on Rick Santorum and says, this guy doesn't care about the unemployment rate. That's how politics works. Little edit. So you got to watch every word you say. Romney, not too long ago, was asked about the entitlement programs in the country, and he said in a careless moment, look, I'm not worried about the poor, because he continued his sentence, because we already have entitlement programs established in the country, and I'm not worried about the rich because they've already got money. The people I'm most concerned about are the people that are in the middle class who are falling from the middle class stature to the bottom. Well, I mean, if you heard him in totality, you'd be like, wow, that sounds pretty reasonable. If Mitt Romney gets the nomination for president, Barack Obama and his team will formulate campaign commercials where they'll take a small bit of that and they'll say, and you'll see in Mitt Romney's own words, I don't care about the poor. And for those who don't pay attention and know the context, you'll be like, oh, that SOB, I wouldn't vote for him in 100 years. You know, I mean, that's how politics works, right? That's the media. So, okay, let's talk about this last piece now. Did I answer your question? Okay. Rephrase your question again to me and make sure I answered it. Do you remember?
I was just trying to figure out how changing to this.
Oh. In other words, there was some ignoring of a process in 1968. Humphrey just ignored it, and everybody said, wait a minute, we got to force these candidates to go through a process here.
So then it went from more of like organizations making decisions to individuals?
Yes.
Okay.
Because the people of Illinois, as individuals, had a say last night, didn't they? And you will in California in June if you want to participate. So that's really, so don't get caught up on all the historical stuff, and I don't care if you know about the 1968 convention. More than anything, I want you to understand now, if you took out a blank piece of paper and had to write 2 intelligible paragraphs on how Mitt Romney will probably emerge as the Republican nominee, you could talk about primaries and caucuses, you could talk about delegates, you could talk about a national nominating convention, yeah? Yeah, and even the number 1144 would mean something to you. Okay, now we're going to move to the general election process, and you're going to see that the magic number is 270, if that number means anything to you. Okay, this. Let me just say a quick word here. This came up in the Democratic nomination process last time around. Most all of the delegates get farmed out based upon how their state votes. The 69 in Illinois last night got farmed out based upon how the people of Illinois chose to vote last night. Some states withhold a few delegates and call them superdelegates. If the Democrats call them superdelegates, the Republicans call them uncommitted delegates or something generic like that. Some of those people, big fat cats within the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, are kind of like kingmakers if they want to be. They can cast their delegate vote in Tampa this summer, these Republican superdelegates. They can cast their votes however they doggone well please. They could vote for me. I mean, those delegates could say, we've missed out. Professor Waller at Biola University should be the Republican nominee for president. They're free to do that. They are untethered to how their particular state voted. That's why they're called superdelegates. In 2008, Barack Obama and Hillary were trying to get to whatever the magic number was for the Democrats that year. For the Republicans, it's 1144. Neither one, because the election was so close between Barack and Hillary, neither one got to the magic number until the superdelegates started weighing in on behalf of Obama. And by mid-June, Obama had enough superdelegates who stood at a podium and said, I declare I'm a Barack Obama delegate now. And that's what put him over the top. Most of the time, these guys do not come into play, but they came into play in 2008. If nobody gets enough to get over the magic number, so let's have a hypothetical here. Let's say that all the primaries and caucuses take place and all the uncommitted delegates on the Republican side do their thing and nobody gets to 1144, then the convention in Tampa would get really, really interesting, because you'd have what's called a brokered convention, where they will just decide in a couple days who the Republican nominee will be, and anybody could emerge from that. I could emerge from that. Not likely, but theoretically, I could emerge from it. Batman back there could emerge. No, you're not 35. You couldn't emerge. Wait till you're 35. I just turned 35, which is a really good thing. Humor me a little bit. All right. Okay, so now let's spend a few minutes talking about the general election, and that's the last part of the deal. And that one I think you're more familiar with, and I think that we can pass by that one pretty quickly. So now we're no longer talking about the nomination process. Now we're talking about how we actually elect a president. Now we're down to, I wish I had an eraser. Now we're down to this. Okay? And even that election is indirect. What you think you're doing when you show up on November 3rd, 4th, whatever it is going to be in 2012, you think you're voting directly for your candidate who you think should be president of the United States. So you show up at the voting booth and you cast your vote for Barack Obama or Mitt Romney or some other minor candidate of your choice, right? You get one vote and you cast your vote. You're thinking, wow, I'm directly voting for Barack Obama, or I'm directly voting for Mitt Romney. Yeah, that's, yeah. You're indirectly voting to commit your state's electoral votes for the candidate. And that is almost winner take all here. So has anybody heard of the Electoral College? Yes? Okay. The magic number of electoral votes to get elected president is 270. Which represents a majority, a simple majority of the electoral votes. California has 53. I'm going to show you an electoral map here after the break. I'm going to dig all this up and show you the actual numbers and how they're working out here. I'm just going to talk about it theoretically now, and then I'm going to show you how the last election came out. All right. So when you think that you show up to your polling booth in November and vote in the general election, and you vote. So let's think about it in California. In California, you could show up and we'll have an election in California, and they'll do the same thing in every state. We don't actually have a national election. We have 50 different state elections, don't we? Right? So you can't, if you're not a citizen of the state of California, you have to vote absentee in your state where you come from, right? All right, so let's just talk about it in California. Registered voters in California in November, I think it's 4th if I recall, will show up and they will cast votes. And I can tell you right now how that vote's coming out, because California is not a contested state. Obama's going to win 60% of the vote and Romney's going to win about 40. Okay? What does that mean? What it means is that California's 53 electoral votes all go to Barack Obama. It's winner take all. If he gets one more vote than Mitt Romney, he will get them all. And that happens in 48 out of the 50 states. Nebraska and Maine sort of do funky things, but for the most part, it's winner take all. Yes?
When was the last time California had a Republican?
80s. 88. Yes.
Why do it that way? Why not?
It's a filter. It is a filter.
Well, like, what's the point? Why do we?
You'll see it. You'll see it. Okay? I want to walk you through another brief historical picture. Again, not so much important to see, to Jennifer's question, not so that you understand how it worked in 1830, but how it works today. There's really only a two-pronged picture here. All right, I see a point here. This number is a function of how many representatives you have in the House of Representatives plus your two senators. So the more populous states, this number is going to be bigger. Small states like South Dakota, you know, they got their two senators and their one House rep. You know, they don't have a lot of punch in the U.S. election for president anyway. We got a lot of punch. If you win that, you're on your way to 270, aren't you? If you win New York, which has about 40, high 40s something, you're on your way. And Barack Obama will win California, New York. I'm willing to bet, and I am a Christian, I am willing to bet you that. Anybody want to take that bet that Barack Obama will not win California and New York? I'd like to talk to you at the break. All right. And I'll bet you dollars to donuts that Mitt Romney will win Texas. And he's likely to win Georgia and Alabama and, you know, much of the South. Okay. All right, so let's tell you this brief story and then we'll let you off here. The original system worked like this. The original system worked just the same way, except for the fact that the electoral votes, how a state's electoral votes went, were not tied to how the state voted, which you, to Jennifer's question, you might think, well, what's the point? So the state, so obviously California wasn't around in 1830. So take the state of Virginia. The good people of the state of Virginia did their voting thing, and you could actually think about a percentage of how they voted. Virginia's electoral college, their number of electoral delegates or members of the electoral college were not committed as their state voted. So the electoral college, Jennifer, used to not be tied to the popular vote. So there might have been 13, 14 people on the electoral college there in Virginia. They could have looked at the result of the vote and gone, well, that's interesting that the people voted that way. Nah, we think otherwise. And they could have cast their electoral vote in a whole different way. Until 1824, when you had a very contentious election, and then it changed. And that's the other half of the story when we start talking about political parties here in the other half of class. So you'll see why we move from this to this in our current system. So since 1832, we've essentially tied this to this. In other words, if you win a state in the popular vote, you get all of that state's electoral votes. And that's how we do it today. So again, in California, that's probably how the vote's going to come out here. So Barack Obama can count on 53 electoral votes being in his column, and he's trying to get to 270. So that one is actually a little more, there is an indirect nature to it. Do you see it now? But it's a little simpler. And the actual electoral college, real people from all over the country get together in Washington, D.C. after the election in November. It happens in early December. There'll actually be a whole group of people who will get all expense-paid trips to D.C., and they will sit in an important building, usually in the Congress, and they will officially cast their electoral votes for the candidates as they had to. So 53 people will show up to D.C. from California in December, and they will, at the right time, say, Obama. That's how it works. That's why that election in Florida in 2000 was so contentious, because they weren't sure how those 27, I think at the time, how those 27 electoral votes would go. If they went to Bush, he'd be president. If they went to Gore, he would have been president. The election in 2000 was decided by 537 votes in the state of Florida. That's how close the election was. Wow. So just to show how this stuff is actually working out, here were the results of the Illinois primary last night. Let me scroll up here to get that up. This is how it was polling. So when they polled people and pollsters tried to guess how they thought it would come out, they thought Romney would win 41% of the vote, Santorum 31, Gingrich 13, so on and so forth. This is how it actually came out. So the polling was not very accurate, because they try to get this thing within 2 or 3 percentage points, called the margin of error. So Romney won outside the margin of error last night. He was only supposed to win 41% of the vote on average, and he won almost 46.7% of the vote. So now we ask, how did those 69 folks get farmed out? Well, we can look down the page here. Actually, it's on the next previous page here. Okay, so we look down in Illinois, and we see they had 69. Can you see that right there? Illinois had 69 electoral votes. Romney got 42 of them. Santorum got 10. These guys got shut out. So obviously that's adding up to 52, which leaves 17 out, right? 17 of the 69 in Illinois are free floaters. They can vote any way they want. So Romney last night picked up 42 delegate votes. Santorum picked up 10. And there's 17 else out there who are free floaters. They can vote for me if they wanted to. But they'll probably vote for Romney. So more likely Romney picked up the preponderance of the remaining 17, just based upon he won handily last night. So when you start, so you can see these haven't been decided, these have, and you can see how these delegate votes are getting farmed out. And at the top of the screen, you can see how Romney's doing there in yellow. He's got 560, Tort is 1144, Santorum is at 246, Gingrich is 141, Paul's at 66. When Romney gets to 1144, he wins. He will win officially at the National Nominating Convention when those real delegates show up and they have a roll call vote and cast their votes for him. Let's see, what else did I? Oh, so just to show you that it's a real live place, that's where the Republicans will meet this summer in Tampa. I mean, those real live people will show up to this nice looking building where the Tampa Bay Lightning play their hockey and do their thing. That doesn't look so bad, right? I mean, Tampa, I invite you to move there and see if you might think otherwise. All right. And then there's all kinds. Here's the New York Times website. Gives you the story in a little bit different way. You know, delegate counts, and he's trying to get up to 1144. So if you're following this on a day-to-day basis, you'll see he's moving toward that. The question is, and the reason these guys are staying in the race is to see if they can get, of the remaining 1,273, if they can get enough of them to keep Mitt Romney from getting over that hurdle. The math is starting to look pretty good that Romney could sort of coast in and get over 1144 right now. I mean, his lead is getting pretty big. Hillary and Barack Obama were like a horse race, and they got right to the cusp, and neither one of them got over the magic number in 2008. And superdelegates had to put them across. Obama in that case. Okay, in terms of then the nomination's over and the election takes place, this is how the election in 2008 came out. California at the time had 55 delegate votes. It's blue. That means Obama. Obama-Biden. So they won the state of California. They got all 55 electoral votes. So any blue state you see here, went Obama. He added up to 365 electoral votes. All he needed was 270. So as soon as he got over 270, it was over. And it was over about, California time, 8:30. Because these eastern states, when Florida went Obama, Ohio, Indiana, North Carolina, and Virginia went, those were the battleground states, and Obama won them all. It was, and then, they're 3 hours ahead of us, right? So we knew fairly early on that it was going to be a good night for Obama. Take, for example, Missouri. Missouri has, my home state, has 11 electoral votes, or at least they did in 2008. That one was very, very close. Let's see here, Missouri. Anybody see it? Where's Missouri? It was one of the, oh, here it is. One of the closest elections. Look at this. 47.8% to 48.5%. Really close. McCain won by 0.7% of the vote. Nevertheless, he gets all 11 of Missouri's votes. All 11. So all you have to do is win by 1 vote and you get all the state's electoral votes, with the exception of Nebraska and Maine. And the way they do it's a little funky. They farm it out by electoral precincts and stuff like that. So if you win in this little area of the state, you'll get so many of the electoral votes. And not surprisingly, here in Omaha, urban area, Obama won that district. McCain took the rest of the state. So McCain got 5 of maybe the 6 electoral votes there. So this is the map you'll watch in November, and you'll be a graduate of this class, but I won't post grades until I heard that on election night you've watched this and you've watched to see who gets to TSEP. So report in, and I'll be sitting there at the computer ready to hit the submit button. No, I won't, of course not, but I invite you to come over. I may even have an election night party here on campus, or where we can put a big screen out there and we'll all just watch election returns come in and eat fatty food and that kind of good stuff. But okay, just to give you a direction of where this is going for 2012, as it looks right now, many of the states that are now blue will continue to stay blue. California, the whole West Coast is likely to stay blue. That's going to be a battleground state. Republicans will be competitive, and it was very close in 2008. That'll be a battleground state. That one will. That one will. That will. Indiana maybe. Ohio definitely. If you don't pay attention at all on election night, how that state goes and that state goes will likely tell you how the election will go. Obama won in Florida last time, pretty close, as I recall. Very top? Okay, he won 49 to 47.2. Pretty close. But as you saw from the electoral map, it's all blue. He gets them all. Ohio was another close one, 48.8 to 46.3. Those are the battleground states. Look at California. Here it is, 58-34. Okay, not competitive. A really fun thing to do if you've never done it is during the high moments of like late October going into November. Yeah, we'll know that there's an election going on and we'll see some signs and people campaigning out here. The candidates will not be out here. What's fun is, and I've done this before, you get on a plane, you take off from a California airport and you land in my case, I landed in Florida. And man, it was like a whole nother world. As soon as you step out of the airport, it's like you're in the middle of this massive electoral fight. That's a battleground state. And again, the battleground states, the ones to look at perennially are these not Illinois, but these states right here generally tend to be competitive. The Northeast is going to vote Democrat. The South is going to vote Republican. And Florida's maybe. Why do you think? What do you know about the state of Florida that would make this different?
Well, tons of people come from the North.
That's it. Yeah, that's right. That's why Florida's a really interesting electoral state, because it's sort of like, it's like mutts. It's like a collection of all kinds of different things. They're not mutts in Alabama and Georgia. They're Southerners. Florida has a mixture of Southern, Northeastern flavor, that kind of thing. Arizona is sort of a mutt state in that regard too. It's sort of a collection state. We're a pretty progressive democratic state. And as the Hispanic population goes up, we get more democratic with a big D in the electoral deal. I can just tell you're riveted on this. Riveted! I've sold you. I've sold you on this. All right. So that's how it's actually playing out. Now let me tell you the other side of the story and tell you about the evolution of political parties in the country. And I think you'll I'll refer back to the electoral cycle, and I think you'll see some things on this side that will help you. Okay. Big picture. American politics used to have no political parties. During the latter half of the 19th century, political parties dominated American politics. During the 20th century, you start to have a less prominent role for political parties in the electoral process. That's the big story. So again, we start with nothing, no political parties. Takes 30, 40 years for political parties to kind of ramp up. They ramp up for a couple decades, and then by the latter half of the 1900s, I'm sorry, the 19th century, latter half of the 1800s, political parties absolutely dominate. If you want to get elected to political office and you're not a toady of a political party, you don't have a hog's chance of getting elected. You sort of that way today, but not necessarily. Starting around the turn of the last century, late 1800s into the 1900s, you get a group of people who go, man, these political parties are just too powerful, and we need to reinvest power back with the people. And one of the ways they try to do this is through primaries and caucuses, right? Did you see how it got more democratic as it went forward? That's one of the progressive reforms that you'll see here in a second. Okie dokie? All right, so let's walk through some political parties and the evolution. You already know this, but during the founding era, we don't have any parties. Our Constitution does not anticipate political parties or take it into account. So when you read the Constitution, as we've looked at throughout this semester and will continue to do, you won't see anything in the original Constitution that speaks to political parties. We have to make adjustments to our Constitution to take into account political parties. I may have mentioned to you that during the original system, whoever got first in the Electoral College won the presidency. Whoever was second was the vice president. So if we still had that system today, Barack Obama may go from being the president to the vice president if he loses. Or Mitt Romney might be Obama's vice president. Well, that's sort of weird. That doesn't work anymore. Why doesn't it work anymore? Well, because we have contending political parties, and it's really odd to have the loser be in the winner's camp. It makes more sense to us now to think, if Obama loses, Mitt Romney doesn't want him around, and he wouldn't be around in that regard. Okay? So the founding era, you saw this. The earliest kind of like political parties, but not real political parties, they're actually what's called cadre parties, but who cares, right? Is what you've already seen already. You get Washington, Hamilton, Adams, these guys, the Federalist. This is not a mass political party. This is not like what you think about when you think about the Democrats and Republicans now. This is an elite game. Political elites, big muckety-mucks in states. Those guys play politics. People in the street, we don't do politics, not with political parties. So these are like elites in society getting together on different governing ideologies, the Federalist and the Jeffersonians. This is the Jeffersonians that I introduced you to a couple weeks ago. And roughly the first 30 years of the country's history is a battle between these two governing ideologies. This one wins. And this is the one that sort of stays around, this one goes away. And I'll tell you a little bit of that story here now. Bless you, ma'am. All right, again, just a bit of an evolutionary story here. Here's where it really starts to get interesting. The Democratic Republicans come to so dominate American politics that the Federalists essentially go away, and a Democratic Republican, James Monroe, runs uncontested for the presidency in 1820. And everybody's so lovey-dovey, huggy-kissy, that they think that the era of good feelings has descended upon the United States and that we will no longer have bitter political contests and that everything will be hunky-dory. Well, that lasts for about 4 years. And then we have one of the nastiest elections we've ever had in history in 1824. So the era of good feelings doesn't last very long. And largely because of the person of Andrew Jackson. Very contentious political figure. Okay? So here we go. Now we really get into the interesting. This is, you and I live in light of the election of 1824 today. Because we have political parties in this country is a function of what happened in 1824. And what happened in 1824 was there was a huge bitter fight for the presidency, largely amongst 4 or 5 main figures in the country: Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and some other guys you've never heard of. And nobody gets to the magic electoral number. Today it's 270. You know, remember I just showed the electoral map, and you've got to get to 270. In 1824, whatever the magic number was back then, I don't know what it was, nobody got there. And so the election had to go to the House of Representatives, and a backroom deal was made there in the House of Representatives, and John Quincy Adams emerged as the President of the United States. He did not even win the most popular votes. So that really hacked off Andrew Jackson, who did win the most popular votes, and they start to institute some electoral reforms. But starting in 1824, you have a split of these Democratic Republicans into 2 different factions. One is, and this should look familiar to you, the Democrats, everybody who loves Jackson, and the Whigs, everybody who hates Jackson. Right? They've got some unity. The only unifying thing they've got is they hate Andrew Jackson. Very polarizing type figure. You either love him or hate him. Okay? And we mentioned a little bit about Jacksonianism. So the 1824 election splits off the era of good feelings, and it breaks up the Democratic Republicans into these 2 things. These guys are going to go away. These guys are still here today. Barack Obama is the leader of this, interestingly enough, right? Republicans are nowhere in the picture right now. All right. The Jacksonian Democrats are really the first modern political party. So in the later part of the 1820s going into the 1830s during this Jacksonian era is where you start to see mass political parties. And what I mean by mass political party is the average person could be a part of a political party. So, you know, take 1836. You could go walk the streets of America and say, are you a Democrat or a Whig? Do you participate in Democratic or Whiggish politics? Yeah. Prior to that, you couldn't. So these are grassroots organizations. They have national nominating conventions, and they're doing a lot of the stuff that we do today, and it all starts back in 1832. So if you look back at your notes and you see the electoral denomination process changing around this time, it's because of that. That's why this is the other side of that story. Okay? So really, the story about political parties, Democrats, Republicans, all this stuff, really starts back in the Jacksonian era, where you start to have mass political parties. Again, the Republicans are nowhere in sight right now, but at least you have mass political parties that start during this time. And the first nominating convention was in 1832 with the Democrats and the Whigs. So what the Republicans will do in Tampa this summer was started essentially back in 1832 with the political parties that existed back then. Okay? All right. The 30 years after that, so roughly from 1830 to 1860, and you probably know this from history classes or whatever you've been exposed to, but just to sort of mention it again, the issue of slavery starts to tear the country apart. Not surprisingly, right? And you get all these compromises. Oh, I don't list them here. You get the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. You get all these compromises, and the goal was to keep the balance of power between slave state interest and non-slave state interest sort of roughly even. As slavery becomes a more contentious issue, the Democrats are largely unified on the issue, and the Whigs become sort of all over the map on the issue. And when you become all over the map on the issue, the party just explodes and becomes irrelevant, and that's roughly what happens. Replacing the Whigs as a party either against slavery in total or against the expansion of slavery is the Republicans. So starting around the 1850s, the Whigs go away, and you get a new political party centered around the abolition of slavery, either in total or against the expansion of it. Lincoln was of that latter sort. Lincoln was not a full-blown abolitionist. He did not, at least politically, take the view that slavery should be eradicated in the South. His view, as you'll see here in a couple weeks, was that slavery should not be allowed to expand to new territories. And you'll see him be very explicit with this here in a couple weeks. The Democratic Party has a bit of a schism as well. The southern wing of the Democratic Party says slavery, yes. The northern wing of the Democratic Party doesn't say no on slavery. They say something called, well, maybe, maybe not. So that's going to play out here in a second. Okay, so far so good? So what have we done? We've looked at the founding era. We have no political parties. We just have different governing ideologies, Federalists and Democratic Republicans. That lasts up until about 1824, and you have a really nasty election. And then you start the advent of mass political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. Slavery rips the Whigs apart. And from roughly the Civil War till today, you get the Democrats and Republicans. And that's largely what we've had since the American Civil War, is Democrats and Republicans. The Democrats go all the way back to Andrew Jackson. The Republicans go essentially all the way back to Abraham Lincoln. That's roughly what we see before us today. Okay. The Democratic Party splits into a northern and southern wing. These are the Southerners. These are the Confederates. This guy, John C. Breckinridge, at one time in his life was the Vice President of the United States. After secession and all that good stuff, southern states start to peel off. Imagine a day where a candidate running for president of the United States, and if the vote in 1860 had gone a different way, instead of Abraham Lincoln being the president of the United States, John C. Breckinridge might have been the president of the United States. He didn't win. John C. Breckinridge fought with the South, was a very prominent political and military figure down south. The northern wing of the Democratic Party, that name probably looks familiar to you in terms of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, was a guy named Stephen Douglas, a senator from the state of Illinois. And he led the northern Democrats, and their view on slavery was what was akin to this idea of popular sovereignty. And that was the idea that if we were going to form a new state, well, let the state decide whether they're going to be a slave state or a free state. That turned out to be a really bad idea, because the first time they tried it was in the Kansas-Nebraska territory, and it led to like a mini civil war starting in the 1850s. Bad idea. And the Lincoln-Douglas debates is roughly between Douglas, who held to this view, and Lincoln, who held to the view that slavery should not be allowed to expand. That there was something inherently morally wrong with slavery, that it ought not be allowed to expand. Douglas was open to the idea that it might expand if the people of the state wanted it to be in their state. So the Lincoln-Douglas debates were sort of largely between those two different camps. Okay? Here's the compromises that I mentioned to you before. The 30 years prior to the Civil War, the name of the game is to try to keep a civil war from happening over the issue of slavery, and you try to keep the balance of power between slave states and free states, and you had all these compromises, and I'm not going to spend any time unpacking those. And you've probably been exposed to them in some form or fashion. All of them can be sort of wrapped up and bow-tied as attempts to keep the guns from going off. Until that happened, a very famous court case in the late 1850s in which the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that a black man wasn't a person, and persons are the only kind of entities that can file suit in federal court, and so Dred Scott found himself labeled as a non-person, and therefore his case was dismissed. And then the judgment ruled further and said that the federal government cannot regulate slavery. It was a state issue. That made the Southerners wildly happy, and the abolitionists not particularly happy, and therefore that was the case that lit the fuse for the Civil War. It's called the Dred Scott decision. Is anybody reading that one in here? I think that's one of our choices. Maybe. Did you? Okay. Yeah. I mean, we look back at it now and think, how in the world could these eminent lawyers of the time sitting on the U.S. Supreme Court ever come to the conclusion that a black man wasn't a person? If you're interested, read her summary. She'll give us a nice little summary how they'll make that argument. If that shocks you, somebody's going to read Roe versus Wade. And in that case, 9 more lawyers sitting on the U.S. Supreme Court are going to make an argument that a developing fetus is not a person. And certain public policy practices flow from that too. So it's really important what goes on in politics and the judiciary and all that stuff. Okay? All right. So that takes us now to the post-Civil War. And largely, the Democratic Party in the South is wiped off the map, right? Because they lose politically and militarily. So when the Southerners, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and all these Southerners, right, the rebels, when they lose militarily, they lose politically, because all of those old Southern Democrats are now politically impotent. By law, they can no longer vote or hold office. Not unreasonable, given the fact that they've just taken up arms against the American government and did all that nasty stuff that we call the Civil War. So that's where you get the term carpetbagger. Now, I remember from my social studies book as a junior high school student, there used to be a picture, and it wasn't a flattering picture, of a guy with a carpet, rolled up carpet, slung over his shoulder, and there was a big bulge in the middle. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who packed up all their worldly goods, rolled them in a carpet, slung it over their shoulder, grabbed the first train down south, and went down there and ran for political office. So you get, in southern states, northern politicians representing southern states. That's what they're called, carpetbaggers. This term stays until this very day. What would you think about the fact? How about the following scenario playing out? Let's say Barack Obama loses to Mitt Romney in November, and he's no longer the president. What if Barack Obama says, hey, I'm not done with politics. I'm going to move to California and run for the United States Senate. People in California would say Barack Obama is a carpetbagger. That's how the term is used today. So any politician who doesn't necessarily live in a state, but just sort of plants themselves there and pronounces themselves running for an office in that state, are still labeled a carpetbagger. Any recent carpetbaggers come across your radar screen? I'd really be impressed if you knew a name or two. I'll give you one, Elizabeth Dole, but you don't know that one. There's a more prominent one, very, very prominent woman, former First Lady of the United States, Hillary Clinton. Why is she a carpetbagger? Where's Hillary from? Arkansas. Hillary was the United States Senator from New York. Had Hillary ever lived a day of her life in New York? Nope. But all of a sudden she and Bill bought a house in upstate New York, real nice place. about a $6 million pad, and she says, I'm running for the Senate in the state of New York, and won twice. So just simply to get labeled a carpetbagger doesn't eliminate you from... Bobby Kennedy, a guy from Massachusetts, did the same thing. He's a Massachusetts guy and ran for Senate in New York and won. The Republicans, Elizabeth Dole, very notable Republican woman from the state of Kansas, moved to North Carolina at just the right time and ran for the North Carolina Senate and won. So anyway, little story here. After the Civil War, I hate not having board space. Roughly the Civil War was a battle between Republicans and Democrats militarily. In the South, you're a Democrat. In the North, you're a Republican. You're with Lincoln and the Republican Party, and you're fighting these rebel Southerners down south. After the Civil War, soldiers who would have fought with the Southern Army continue to vote Democrat. Northern soldiers who fought with U.S. Grant and General Sherman voted Republican. Then comes the crime of '73. I'm just telling you a little story here, just play out, see a little political theater here. The crime of '73 is when the country moved back to the gold standard. Now, I have surely someone in here who's a burgeoning economist, and you tell me what happens to the money supply when a country which was off the gold standard moves back to it. The gold standard is when you have a one-to-one correspondence between the amount of currency that you have in circulation and gold to back it up. That's being on the gold standard. We're nowhere near that today, as you might guess. But in 1873, we moved back to the gold standard. What happens when we move back to the gold standard? Come on now, somebody in here. Does the money supply go up or down? Down, thank you very much. Which increases or decreases the value of the money? Okay, so think about it. Oops, I don't have my wallet on me. So if you pull out $1 in 1870, it's worth so much, right? After 1873, that same dollar is worth more. So if you've already got a lot of money, you've just become richer overnight. If you don't have money and need it, like in the form of a loan, it's more expensive to get in the form of a higher interest rate. Following this? After this, Southerners who used to vote Democrat and Northerners who used to vote Republican, agrarians, like farmers, they used to vote how they shot. You know, if you're a Southerner, you shot with the Confederates, you vote Democrat, Republican, you shot Northern, you vote Republican. For the first time after the Civil War, this issue of money becomes harder to get, and Southern and Northern farmers both suffer. And they say, the heck with Republicans, the heck with Democrats, we're going to become populists. And they form a new political party called the Populists. And this is an agrarian-based movement. This is Northern and Southern farmers ticked off that these Northeastern bankers have just gotten richer overnight, and they're getting gouged on loans for their farms and their mortgages and this kind of thing. And they call for political change. So this is around the late 1800s going into the early 1900s. You have a group of farmers who organize politically, and they say that we're getting ripped off here with the money supply. The rich Northeastern banking interests are getting rich on this deal, and we're paying the price. And they try to organize politically under that label. So it's almost like another kind of political party that surfaced for a while. They more or less, sort of like the Tea Party. Have you heard about this group today? The Tea Party. It's sort of a separate political party, but not. Most of these Tea Party folks tend to vote Republican. Most of the populists still tended to vote Democrat. But then there's this huge election in 1896, and I think that's my next slide. And it's essentially a referendum kind of election. In other words, it's an announcement that how this election goes is going to represent a major shift in terms of how the country would go. In 1896, there's a major election between a guy named Williams Jennings Bryan, that may sound familiar to you, and McKinley, a Republican. The populists get behind this guy, along with the Democrats, and the Republicans get behind this guy. He wins a pretty handily in this election, and the country decides to reject cheap money and go with being fiscally conservative. It is in the election of 1896, and Republicans still sort of have this label handed on them or hung on them right now, that the Republican Party is the party of big corporate interests and all that stuff. It goes all the way back to 1896. The Democratic Party, from all the way back into 1896, portrays themselves as the party of the people. These are the party of the rich. These are the party of the working man. It goes all the way back to 1896. Question, in that light, who do you think got more money donated to his campaign in 2008 from Wall Street, these big corporate, high financier type people? McCain or Obama? McCain, you would think, right? Wrong. I'm just telling you how parties posture themselves in reality is often very different. Obama, by large margins, got more money from the big corporations and Wall Street interest in 2008 than John McCain did. Why do you think that was the case? How politically savvy you guys are. Obama and the Democrats hold themselves out as the party of the people, and they talk bad about the rich, and we need to tax them more and all that stuff. But those very same people he talked bad about, or he talks bad about now, supported him in his campaign in 2008 in higher numbers than McCain. That is an eyebrow wrinkler. Why do you think that's the case? The answer is because these people who give big money are not stupid. They place bets in a sense that when they give campaign contributions, they're betting on the winner. And 2008 was a good year for Democrats, and it was likely that the Democratic nominee for president was going to be the next president, and these people aren't fools, and so they put their money where they think the winner was going to be, and they, in that sense, acted wisely. Yeah. So one of the things I'm trying to do here in this class is to get you beyond sort of this slogan label stuff you hear. You're going to hear Democrats talk about being party of the people, and these nasty Republicans are these people, and they'll say insults about these folks. In political reality, it's a lot more complicated than that. Some of the richest politicians in the country are Democrats. You know, Mitt Romney, as we go forward, probably past June, is going to be labeled a rich, insensitive person who doesn't know what it's like to experience sort of normal type blah, blah, blah. Mitt Romney's wealth pales in comparison to John Kerry, who ran for the Democratic nomination for president in 2004.
Romney knows that they're gonna attack him in that way because he's already talked about it. So how do you think he's gonna counter that?
Well, it's going to be hard. In that sense, it's going to be hard because he was a kind of guy who was born into wealth and that kind of thing, but he is going to try to portray himself as a person who just didn't sit around with a silver spoon in his mouth all his life, but that he actually got out there and created jobs and was part of it. You know, he got out of bed every morning and went to work, and he didn't go play golf every day. If the election is largely an economic one and the American electorate says, I think you're in a better position to fix the economy, Obama's had 4 years and he hasn't done it, and Romney, we think you are the guy, he'll win. If the election's primarily economic, Romney will play to his strengths, and it will lessen the charge that he's just some rich guy born with a silver spoon in his mouth. he can portray himself, as he's trying to do, as a fixer. That's what I do. I come in and I fix things. Like the Olympics were headed off the cliff, I came in and I saved those. Massachusetts, I turned a deficit into a surplus. I fixed things. And I'll do that for the United States too. That's what he's going to argue. All right. So after 1896, because this election went Republican, for the next 30 years, Republicans dominate until the Great Depression comes along. And then these guys start to gain political force. Now, I mentioned to you that mostly during the 19th century, political parties dominated, right? Political parties, if you wanted to be elected to public office, you had to really pay your dues with a political party and show yourself long service and all that stuff. These folks come along and say, wait a minute, American society is changing and it's becoming less agricultural and more industrial, and that has political implications. So a group of people around the late 1800s, early 1900s called progressives argue that because of the growing urbanization and industrialization of society, we've got different issues now. In small town America, people don't take advantage of each other that much. In big, urban, not agricultural, more industrial America, the potential for people taking advantage of each other, crime, all this stuff, and they argue that government is the solution to those problems. Prior to the progressives, no one was out there arguing for big government. Progressives talked about the need for bigger government. So Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive. Woodrow Wilson was a progressive. William Howard Taft. So for the first 20, 30 years of the country in the 1900s, you have progressive presidents largely talking about bigger government. But the government is still very small in its size and scope compared to what it is today. Barack Obama describes himself as a progressive. That is a plank of Obama. So, that's not a partisan statement. He would agree. If he was sitting right here and say, sir, would you describe yourself as a progressive in this? And he would say yes. That wouldn't be a slam. He would accept that label. In fact, he describes himself as a progressive. So the progressives talked about it. One of the characteristics of the progressives was they said, look, these parties are getting too powerful and that we need to re-democratize the American electoral system. So they institute what's called progressive reforms. And all of these reforms are meant to weaken party power and re-empower people, real live American people. So they do these kinds of things, and we looked at that one. If you understand the nature of a primary, like the Illinois primary yesterday, where real live people got to vote, the Republican Party of Illinois didn't simply just dictate that Mitt Romney was going to be their man. The actual people of Illinois got to. That's much more democratic, and that weakens the Illinois Republican Party. Does everybody sort of see that? All of these reforms have the effect of weakening political parties. Let me tell you what each one of these are. Normally, when you vote on things, people don't directly vote, right? We let our elected representatives and legislatures do this. One of the progressive reforms was there are some things that are so important in society that we should have the people vote directly on them. So you do this in the form of an initiative or referendum where, like in California, it's a very progressive state. We have initiatives and referendums where the people vote directly on things. That's one of the progressive reforms. Recall elections. If we don't like the way our governor is going, we can recall him. And we did in California, if you recall, 5-6 years ago. More like 8. Used to be that state legislatures would elect your senator. Today, along with the 13th Amendment, we get to vote on who our senators will be. All of these, if you're following this, has the effect of giving people more power and weakening political parties. And then we've already talked about primary elections. Any questions about those? So the progressives are about 2, maybe 3 main things. The first thing is they're concerned about political parties getting more powerful, and they institute a lot of progressive reforms. And California has bought into all of these, and we're a very progressive state in that regard. The other big thing that the progressives are about is they say that government needs to ramp up to deal with issues of society, solving social ills, getting involved in the alleviation of poverty, big government programs, all that kind of stuff. Sound familiar? Okay. Progressives talk about it. This next group of people actually put it in place. And that is not the bull moosers, the Democrats of FDR. In 1932, well, right in the aftermath of the stock market crash in 1929, the Republicans, the Hoover administration, find themselves presiding over the Great Depression, and the people throw out the Republicans, and in comes FDR and the New Dealers. Does this ring any bells? The New Dealers are progressives. They think that the way you're going to get out of the economic problems of the Great Depression is from the top down. The government manages the economy. And that's what the New Deal was. It was a series of legislative programs meant from the top down for the government to involve itself in things that it had never been involved in before, toward the effort of trying to rescue the economy as it was in free fall there with the Great Depression. And FDR and the Democrats start in 1932 and become the dominant party in American politics largely through the 1960s, with the exception of Eisenhower, and he's a Republican, but yeah, it's sort of like the 1950s. Eisenhower was just a war hero. Yeah, he was a Republican, but he was just sort of seen as almost an apolitical figure, that kind of thing. So starting in 1932, the Democrats become associated with helping the country dig out of the Great Depression, and they dominate American politics for the next 40 years. It's not until really Ronald Reagan takes the presidency that you see a turn away from this to a very different thinking about governance, smaller, more limited government. So again, let's back up. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, you get a group of politicians, thinkers, political people talking about progressivism. The government needs to do more to solve social ills. Well, they talk about it until the 1930s, and they start to do it. This is where the size and scope of the federal government goes like this. And that's really been the history of where we're at. The election of 2012, Mitt Romney will run against this. Mitt Romney will say that, look where this has taken us. We have added $6 trillion to our debt in the last 3 years. We had a debt in 1992 of less than $1 trillion, I believe. From 1992 to 2012, we have accumulated $16 trillion plus dollars. In the last 3 years, we've added $6 trillion. If the president's proposed budget passes in the next 10 years, we will add another $12 trillion to the debt. That is what Mitt Romney will run against. I was at a conference, and they were all a bunch of political folks talking, and said at the national convention in Tampa, what Mitt Romney should do is stand at a podium with a debt clock beneath him and just stand there and say, I'm not for this, and walk away. That's what they said his nomination speech should be about. Now, the problem with that speech is, and just to sort of give you sort of the balance, George Bush doesn't have much to brag about. In his 8 years in office, we added about $4 to $5 trillion in debt. So the Republicans talk about smaller, more limited government, but one of the biggest debt busters was a program that Bush and the Republicans instituted to add a certain prescription coverage to Medicare and Medicaid, and it was a budget buster. Yes.
Did that take place in the last 2 years?
Who?
For Bush, with his like increased spending.
That was in his first term. That
It was like all throughout.
Yeah, and there was these little issues of Afghanistan and Iraq that obviously cost money. So those were issues that pushed the national debt up. But this prescription coverage, which my mother just loves. I mean, she's on Medicare, and to add that, but it comes at a cost. Largely in the last 3.5 years, Obama's tack has been to raise and spend money from on high and inject it from the top down. And it's largely added, like I say, about $6 trillion to the debt. The argument was that this will stimulate the economy. So we had two different stimulus programs. And the argument Romney's going to make is they haven't been very stimulative. We've just rat at $6 trillion of debt, and we've got nothing to show for it. We'll see. That's what the American people are going to judge on. Okay, so everybody square with the New Deal and political parties. Post-World War II is a really interesting time. After World War II, you start to see for the first time since the Civil War a lessening of control of the South on behalf of the Democrats. And here's why. After World War II, the following argument is starting to be made within American political society. Now, wait a minute. These black men who fought and died by the hundreds of thousands in World War II are coming back from European and Japanese theaters of war, and we're treating them like this? And the National Democratic Party is sort of at the forefront of this and go, wait a minute, this isn't right. And they start pushing in the late 1940s, 1950s for civil rights reform. The southern wing of the Democratic Party, not unexpectedly, is not excited about this. And so they run in 1948 their own candidate called a Dixiecrat, a guy named Strom Thurmond. This starts to break up the South for the Democrats because they run their own candidate in 1948. And by the 1960s, you start to see the South start to vote Republican for one of two reasons. So this is the post-World War II environment. Right after this, you get Brown versus Board of Education in the early 1950s, and then you get civil rights reform in the 1960s, and that's going to have a polarizing effect on the two political parties at this particular point. Moving forward, in the 1960s, I'm glad that I was too young to remember my days in the 1960s. It was a tumultuous time, to say the least. Some people have described it as a slum of a decade. If you ever want to watch a movie and then feel like you have to take a shower afterwards, there was a movie made on Woodstock not too long ago. A buddy of mine who travels the country consulting sort of flew into town one night and he says, let's go watch this movie. I've heard interesting things about it. And it was this movie on Woodstock in the 1960s. And it was sort of the indicative of the 60s in general, just sort of this countercultural, just, you know, sexual revolution, drugs, all the stuff that went along with Woodstock. And it just was sort of this you just walked out of the theater going, just felt dirty. Anyway, the 1960s starts a culture war, and it's during the 1960s that the Democratic Party starts to go one way on cultural issues and the Republican Party go another. The two parties, the Republican Party comes to be known as the Social Conservative Party, more or less, and the Democratic Party in the 1960s starts to take more liberal or progressive views on things like sex, abortion, homosexuality, these kinds of social issues. Prior to the 1960s, there's not a whole lot of difference between Republicans and Democrats on social issues. After the 1960s, quite a bit of difference. This causes the South, who tend to be more traditional, right, in there's more religion going on down South. They tend to be more conservative in that regard. It starts to cause many Democrats, former Democrats down South, to start to vote Republican, starting mostly in the 1980s. But you can look back and you can start to see a shift in that. The other way of thinking about this is the South goes from being Democrat to Republican and this is one charge, I don't think it holds water, but people argue this, is that the Republicans appealed to white Southerners and said, vote for us, we're the party of white supremacy. So vote for us, these Democrats are about civil rights reform and we're not, and vote for us. There's not a whole lot of evidence that shows up empirically for that, but that's another argument for why the South went from being Democrat to Republican. As you saw on the electoral map not too long ago, you saw that the South is solidly Republican now. One of the notable things in the 2008 election was that Barack Obama won Virginia and North Carolina. Those were two states that were not contested. It'd be like Romney winning California. That's how big a shift happened in those two states. So, okay. So the 1960s is a very key time. The 70s is of interest to you and me because most people look at people like you and me and they say, these evangelicals, and they just talk about us as a lump sum. These evangelicals start to actually get more politically active in the 1970s, and they rally around a Southern evangelical, Jimmy Carter, for the presidency in 1976. Evangelicals as a whole had largely been politically dormant since the early 1900s, and they sort of awake from their sleep politically and start to become more politically involved, at least initially on Carter, a Democrat side, in 1976, and then by the 1980s, evangelicals get really behind and excited about Ronald Reagan. And this is Reaganism, the marriage of fiscal and social conservatism. Republican candidates today will point back and say, I'm the new Reagan. So everybody's looking back to say, I'm the new Ronald Reagan won 2 landslide elections. He won 49 out of 50 states in 1984. Walter Mondale ran against him in 1984 and barely won his own home state of Minnesota, and that was it. That's how popular Reagan was across the country. And so now Newt Gingrich is going to stand up there and say, I knew Ronald Reagan loved me, and blah, blah, blah. And Rick Santorum will say, no, 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 I'm the new Reagan, and all that stuff. It all harkens back to this. Reagan won landslide elections because thousands, millions of people identified themselves as Reagan Democrats. You win elections in landslides when you get a large number of the opposing party to identify with you. And Reagan Democrats started to become a new phenomena in the 1980s. Largely, many of these former Reagan Democrats are now solid Republicans now, mostly again down south. All right, moving to now our present divides and ending, and we'll address any issues we need to now. The current divides in the country and what you're seeing now at the end of this fairly long story, what generally divides the Republicans from the Democrat are 2 issues, this one and this one. This has a social connotation, this has a fiscal or economic connotation. Democrats, in general, are for progressivism, big entitlement programs, bigger government. If we have a problem in society, the solution is the next government program away. That's largely what Democrats argue. And they want to tax higher socioeconomic folks in society to pay for these things. So you'll see the president arguing that especially during these tough economic times, we need to have people who have more pay more so that the government has more money to do this kind of stuff. That's, I mean, I'm trying to be fair, that's essentially what the president is arguing, and Democrats in general. Republicans talk about smaller government. One of the reasons McCain got beat pretty handily in 2008 is because Republicans looked back at the 8 years of the Bush administration, fiscal conservatives, economic conservatives, and said, George, the government just got bigger under your tenure, and I'm not excited, and when people aren't excited, they generally don't vote in massive numbers, and McCain paid for that. So we'll see if that plays out for the Democrats. I mean, in 2010, Democrats were pretty down low, and the 2010 midterms went Republican big time. We'll see what the electoral environment is there in 6 months. There is also a huge religious divide, and again, this has a social connotation, meaning social issues. In general, the more, and the numbers bear this out, the more religious you are, the more likely it is that you're a Republican. The less religious, meaning different measures, how often you read your Bible, pray, attend church. Just empirically, the numbers say that if you do more religious type stuff, you're more likely to be a Republican, and vice versa, you're a Democrat in general. How does that play out? It plays out like this. Within different denominations, there's more conservative elements and more liberal elements. So take the Presbyterian Church, for example. There's the PCUSA and the PCA element, right? Within Presbyterianism. If you're part of the PCUSA movement, there's, boy, I could be stepping on some toes, so I'll just sort of speak in third person. There would be people who would argue that the PCUSA theology is a little less orthodox or conservative than the PCA version. So if you identify yourself as a PCUSA, Presbyterian Church of America, and the USA version, it's more likely you're a Democrat. If you identify yourself with the PCA, you're probably a Republican. So where political divides religiously used to be between denominations, Catholics tended to vote Democrat, Protestants tended to vote Republican. Now the political divides in the religious circle is between the more conservative elements within denominations versus liberal or more modernist elements within denominations. So if you're a conservative Catholic and a serious Catholic, you'll probably vote Republican. If you're a less serious Catholic, you don't show up to Mass as much and you don't take your Catholicism as seriously, you're probably a Democrat. So that's sort of the political divides in the country now, and that's stepping on a lot of toes, I know, but that's just in general the way it is.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.